everyone. My name is Samia Ashraf. I am a Flutter GDE and a Women Techmakers Ambassador. And along with that, I'm also a co organizer at two of the communities in Dubai. It's Flutter Abu Dhabi and Dubai, and also GDG Dubai. So today, I'll be talking about a very interesting topic, which is prepare how you can prepare for your next Flutter job interview. And this basically, here I will be sharing some tips and tricks on what helped me and what I have seen others talking about and from others' experiences. So, all of this I will be discussing it today. And if you're someone who is a complete beginner, then this video will definitely help you. And if you're someone who's intermediate or in advanced level, then you can also stick to the very end and then share some of your tips and tricks. So, with that, let me discuss the agenda for today. Today, I'll be starting with some resume tips. We all know, right? Like for any job interview, to get to land an interview at a company, the first thing that will help you is your resume. Next would be some technical interview tips, some practical interview tips, and finally some tips on how you can improve. Basically, the overall how you can improve yourself. So let us start with the resume tips. Now, resume is equally an important step. So, basically, a document that will consist of your social links, your work experiences, your educational background, your personal projects, and everything that you have done professionally. And this is very important to keep up to date. If there is any project that you're working on and which just finished, it's very important to update all the details about that project in the resume. And this is because the more projects you have, and the more projects you have, it is better. So, and also a cover letter. Now, cover letter is again a very important aspect because the first thing that any company would notice or any company will consider is your resume and cover letter. Now, cover letter is a short form or a short version of your resume where you're not going to elaborate your experiences. You're just going to write few lines about yourself and your title or whatever you are. And resume is an elaborated form that is going to consist of all of the details which we just discussed, which is professional details, your work experiences, and also your personal projects. And also up to date GitHub profile. You should be, like I said, you should be having all of your social links in the resume. And make sure that your GitHub profile is always up to date. And if you don't have a GitHub profile, it is very important to create one because oftentimes what happens is companies will look at your GitHub profile and that will give them an idea of what kind of projects you're working on and what basically what you're doing professionally. So all of your personal projects are definitely going to be in GitHub and that will give them an idea of how you manage it. And there is also something called as GitHub badges, right? So it's always a plus point if you have the GitHub badges, because that way you can stand out from other candidates who don't have the GitHub badge. GitHub badge, you get it for a reason because of the contribution to the community. The next would be including the best work on the resume. This is very important because let's say you have around 15 to 20 projects that you've worked on, or 10 to 20 projects, and it's not compulsory to list all of those projects in the resume. Then your resume is going to become very long, and that's not really advisable. So always prefer quality over quantity. Quality of your project, that is, if it is a project that involves very complex UIs and very complex functioning, then always the best idea to put those projects in the resume rather than projects which you have just created when you were learning some online courses. So yeah, that's the difference. Even me, I tend to avoid the projects which I had created during my online courses. I don't prefer to put them in the resume because those are very simple, right? There are many people who have done those projects. So definitely prefer quality over quantity, and a link to portfolio that will consist of list of all your personal projects or just projects in general. And this is again very important because first would be the GitHub, a place where the company is going to get an idea of your professional works. And the second place will be a resume. Now, this resume can be also, portfolio link. A portfolio link is basically website that is going to consist of all of your details, starting from your work experience, your personal projects, everything about yourself. So you can either maintain a resume or a portfolio link. Always best to have both of them. And in the resume, add a link to the portfolio. And this portfolio, either you can create a website or you can take some ready projects and treat them as a starter pack and add your details into those projects. So always good to have a link dedicated to your works. So that in that way also you can stand out from the other candidates because not everybody will have a link dedicated to their projects. So those were some of the resume tips that helped me during my hiring process and my interview process. So, next are some technical interview tips. Now, these tips I'm basically accumulating them during my during the time when I interviewed some candidates, and also from the time where I was the candidate that was being interviewed. So these concepts are all coming from that experience. Now, the first step, let's say that your resume was shortlisted and you have been called for an interview. So, from depends on company to company. Sometimes it is the technical interview that comes first, and some other times it is the practical interview that comes first. So, let us assume that technical interview is the first step now. So some concepts that can be that the interviewer can ask you I have noted them down here. So starting with some core Flutter questions, these are extremely important because this will give the interviewer an idea of how much knowledge you have about Flutter, and these are core Flutter concepts that they're going to ask. So first, there will be the types of widgets. There will be stateful and the stateless widgets. And you need to know the difference between the two. Both of these, it's important. And stateful widget lifecycle, again, very important one. This is a very common question, that is to explain the life cycle of a stateful widget. And you need to know what are the life cycle methods and also what do those methods do, what are the different stages and their definition, and also helping it with the scenario. The next would be some asynchronous programming basics. Again, we use asynchronous programming when we are dealing with the APIs or data that is going to come from that is data that will be dependent on some other method. So that time we will be using asynchronous programming, and we all know that API is used in almost every app that connects to the internet. So you will be expected to know about asynchronous programming, how to use async and await keywords, and what are they used for, why are they used for, and how you can use them. And what happens if you don't use async and await, what are the consequences, and how it can affect your program, your app. Role of PubSpec is another important one. What will happen if you don't have a pubspec.caml file in the project, and why is it important? What what are the things that goes into this file, and yeah, everything. So you also need to explain about the different um, the the fonts, the image that we add, basically the assets that you include in your program are all going to be um, called from the PubSpec. You need to have them in the PubSpec before you use them in the app. So that is one main thing why we have PubSpec. And the main one, another one would be the packages. We need to declare the packages first before we use them in the app. And yeah, so basically, just what is the role of PubSpec? And finally, some advantages of Flutter, because we all know that there are different cross-platform frameworks, and why Flutter, how Flutter is different from them, and what are the advantages of Flutter. So these are some core Flutter questions that repeatedly get asked. So make sure that you know, if not all, then most of these. Then the main one that we have is Flutter architecture. This is very important again, because this is a question that gets asked in almost, I think, every interview. At least for me, this was a constant one. What are the different architectures, and what architectures do you use, and why do you use them? So you don't need to know all of the architectures, but maybe the ones that you have worked with, and which one do you like the most, or which one do you work with the most, and why do you prefer it when compared to the other architecture methods, architecture types. Yeah, and Flutter architecture. So if you're a beginner, a complete beginner, and you don't know what is Flutter architecture, then I highly recommend you learn about the Flutter architecture. So, if you're starting with a Flutter online course, then this topic is definitely going to be included. So, do a good research on this one. The next one is data structures and algorithms. So, now this is not something that will be highly focused in the interview. This is what I have noticed, but this is very important for you to understand how Flutter works. The data structures and algorithms is a concept that most of us have learned in college. And this is because this forms the core basics of your programming skills. You need to know how to handle the data, how to structure the data, and also how to write algorithms, that is, functions. So, data structures is very important. And when I started out with Flutter, there was a very popular course on YouTube from Free Code Camp, and the author was Mahmoud Hassan. So I have a link to that. I'll share the link of it soon. So I have referred the basics of Dart from his video, and it is a very helpful one. You will be introduced to all of the concepts that you're going to work with in Dart, most of the concepts, and I think it's a very simple video, and it covers all of those basics. So definitely try that out if you are on if you're planning on starting with the basics of Flutter. You should definitely try that video. It's very helpful one. Next, I have the Flutter tests. Now, you need to know how to write tests in Flutter. It's a very important one. So the types of tests will be asked, and what are the different types of tests with the definitions, and how they are all different. So make sure you learn about some of the types of Flutter tests, like unit testing, widget testing, and integration testing. And at least try a sample example of how you can do testing. And the last one would be the dependency injection. This is again, if you're a beginner, then the chances are very less that you'll be asked this question. But to intermediates and advanced level, this is a very important one, how you can inject dependency in your app. So there are multiple packages on how you can do this. So definitely do give this a read. Next, we have some practical interview tips. So, let's say you've been shortlisted, the first round is clear, second round, you have passed your technical interview as well. Now, let's jump to the practical interview where some of the tips, these are some of the tips. So, one common challenge that will be given is you will be given a very challenging UI and asked to replicate that. So it can be anything. It can be including some animations. It can be including some very tricky tabs. So tab bars, when you add a bit of imagination into tab bars, they become difficult to replicate or challenging to replicate. So always practice UI. I think this is also the start. It should be something that you do from the beginning. UI is very simple. UI, you don't have to really think for it. Just study the different type of widgets and see how you can make complex UI out of them. So dribble.com has really good UIs. You can take those for reference or any UI in general and try to replicate them using the Flutter widgets. Practice as much as you can and also practice till a point that you become very swift. You become very quick in finishing the UI. This will also help you in your work environment. The next one is sometimes you will be given a UI design, let's say a simple one, that is list view, and you will be asked to call API, parse the data, parse the response from the API, and then connect them into the UI, display them in the UI. So let's say there is an API that gives the list of tasks. So you will be asked to display these tasks in the form of a list view in UI. So this is a very common one, especially for beginners. This is a very interesting and a common one. So you need to know how to design different types of UI, and you also need to know how to call an API from your Flutter project and how to catch the response in an object, in a model, and how to parse them. So all of these you need to know. And finally, you need to know how can you pass this data to the front end. So this forms your this forms the basics of building a Flutter app, and definitely do start out with this. Once you have perfected your UI skills, go go to the API part and practice. There are many practice APIs that are like ready made, readily available. So take them as a reference and practice building UI, storing them in models, and then passing them to front end. Parsing the API response is very important and it's very tricky. So once you deal with the simple API responses, go for APIs that are that are sending uh, difficult, that are sending nested data. So nested JSON is again becomes a little tricky. So the more you practice, the more you will perfect it. So start with simple JSON data, and then you can go for nested JSON response data. The other one would be tricky data structure and algorithm questions. So, like I said, not every interview this will be asked, but most of them this will be. So, out of all the interviews that I had attended, one of them did have questions related to data structures. And I feel that this is mainly there to check how you can think when you have been given a task. So, yeah, this is basically to how check how logically you think. And again, the questions here will be very tricky. Obviously, they will not give you simpler questions. So practice some DSA questions. This can also help you professionally because programming is all about logic, putting your logic in the form of code. So yeah, definitely check out the tricky data structure algorithm questions and try to solve it on your own. Then some type of practical tests will be bug fixing on code that has been already built by someone else. So that code, when you run it, it's going to give you a list of errors, a list of bugs that needs to be fixed. So you need to sit and fix these bugs and then make it into a runnable code. So that again requires some knowledge and practice. So definitely try these kind of tests as well. You can just Google and try to get some sample code which contains bugs and try to solve it on your own. And for this, you need to have a clear understanding of how widgets work. So, those were some of the practical interview tips. And finally, I would like to conclude with some tips to improve the technical skills. So, always start with an online course if you're a beginner, because this will expose you to a lot of concepts that you would otherwise not uh, learn without an online course. If you're planning to learn Flutter on your own by reading articles or by reading just documentations, that can become little tricky, because from an online course, you're actually learning from somebody who is experienced and somebody who has already perfected this skill. So, always a good experience to learn from an online course, and prefer those courses that have some um, examples in them, example apps that they build. And yeah, there is no good online course or bad online course, just the one that covers most of the things and that has a lot of practice apps can be an ideal online course. And practice the UI designs as much as possible, because this is going to help you speed up programming. And practice UI designs that have some tricky design patterns, because this will improve your ability to think logically. And like I discussed, learn to pass JSON response. It's very important. If you only know how to build UI, then you cannot actually build a professional Flutter app. You need to know how to parse the JSON data, because like I said, all the apps are connected to the internet, most of them these days. And any app that is connected to internet will be using the APIs. So you need to know how to parse them. And with the concept of asynchronous programming, it's very important. Build personal projects and always keep them updated. So when you have a GitHub profile, you need to populate it with something that is your personal projects. And if you're a complete beginner, it can be a very simple app, something like generate a random number, or it can be anything, design a quiz game. So you don't have to make it a very complex one, it can be very simple. But it is mandatory, I would say, to have some personal projects that you have come up with, that is your own idea, and keep them updated and also publish them to the GitHub. Contribute to the Flutter official repository. So, Flutter official repository on GitHub has some issues. So, you can, if you know how to solve those issues, you can definitely try to do that. This will again highlight your resume from the others. And finally, have at least one published Flutter app, because this is nowadays a minimum requirement to apply for a job. That is, you need to have minimum 2 or 3 Flutter apps that have already been published to App Store and Play Store. And so, if you're a complete beginner, you will still notice that this is a mandatory requirement. That is because you will be expected to do these. You can even publish your personal projects. Like I had published a personal project um, before getting hired for my first position. So companies will expect you to do this, and that will just show how passionate you are about Flutter. And if you don't have a very big project, that is completely fine. Just build a simple to do app or a quiz app, even a random name generator, number generator. and wallpaper apps. So these are the simpler ones that you can start with, and which has a lot of examples on YouTube. So just follow one of those tutorials and just add some of your own concepts into it, change it a little bit. Don't publish the same app as it is. That's just not very logical. But add your own concepts, maybe few things that you want to make tweaks and changes. So do that and then publish at least one app. So you will definitely stand out from the rest of the applicants. So this way you can make sure that your resume and your whole interview process will be different from others. So that's all for this. That's all for today. So if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat box.